Hi, ladies and gentlemen. With another episode of the Alternate Narrative, we have Michael Kugelman from the Wilson Center. Without delving into, his profile, because a lot of people in Pakistan and Afghanistan and India, this South Asian region, know him and know his work. So I would not introduce him with a lot of, waste a lot of time with the introduction. They'll just get straight to Mr. Kugelman, and then would pose a few questions to him about the evolving situation in Afghanistan, Pakistan's role, and what lies in this for the region. Where do we see the region going in the next few years? So let's welcome Mr. Kugelman. Hi, sir.
Hello, great to be here with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking the time. And of course, sir, you would know that this region is at the crossroads right now with the evolving situation in Afghanistan, and how Pakistan has been blamed, by the U.S., by India, countries in the neighborhood, by international power players, that Pakistan is to blame for whatever wrong has happened in Afghanistan. And of course, Afghanistan is a mess right now. I've written somewhat about the Afghan economy, and which is a much less focused area of the Afghan politics, because generally Afghanistan is looked at as a conflict region, and therefore there's a lot of focus on the Afghan politics, its relations with countries in the neighborhood, and so on and so forth. But very less has been written about the Afghan economy. So I'll ask you a few questions about the Afghan economy as well, but just wanted to start with the kind of narrative that is woven around the conflict, and what has happened, and what lies in this in this entire Afghan episode for the region. So starting with how the American narrative about Afghanistan and this region has changed, and what do you think about how the Biden administration's narrative on Pakistan's role in the Afghan crisis? Do you think Donald Trump said, the previous American president said that Pakistan is safe havens of terrorism, and Pakistan has had a role to play in the Afghan crisis in this conflict, and Pakistan has been supporting some Taliban groups while it targets the others. Do you think that narrative, that American narrative, or that state policy about Pakistan's role in the Afghan crisis and terrorism in the region, has that really changed when Joe Biden stepped into the White House?
Yeah, well, again, thank you for having me for this conversation. I guess I heard two great questions there. One is, how has the U.S. narrative on Afghanistan changed or evolved, and how does Pakistan play into this? So taking the first question about the U.S. narrative, it's easy to forget. It's been 20 years. In fact, this week marks 20 years since U.S. forces entered Afghanistan, since the war began. At that time, in October 2001, and really for a few years after that, the U.S. narrative, so to speak, around the war in Afghanistan was very focused on this idea that the war had to be fought, that it was a necessary war, even a noble war. These are some of the words that were used in Washington to describe the war. And I think one can understand that sentiment. At the time, looking back at the time, the U.S. had suffered this incredibly traumatic tragedy, the 9/11 attacks. And, given the U.S., the way that U.S. governments think about the notion of response, there was no way at that time that the U.S. was not going to use military force to respond to that attack. There had been efforts to get the Taliban in Afghanistan to turn over the Al-Qaeda leadership. That didn't happen. U.S. forces then enter the country and start fighting the war. And, I think that at that time, public opinion in the U.S. was very supportive in favor of going into Afghanistan to go get these terrorists that had done this horrific thing in D.C. and New York and Pennsylvania. So, for quite some time, the war was fairly popular. There was always a pocket, some pockets of resistance and opposition to the war for sure. And even within the Bush administration, which of course was the U.S. government that had launched the war, there had been some differences in views in terms of how the war should be waged, how long the U.S. should stay, and so on. But for the most part, there was a fair amount of support and a consensus around the idea that the U.S. had to go into Afghanistan to fight the war. The narrative started to change in the few years after the war. And you had made several major milestones. One was at the end of 2001, the US achieved its goals. It achieved its initial goals. It essentially eliminated the Al-Qaeda sanctuaries in Afghanistan, and it removed the Taliban, which had been hosting Al-Qaeda, from power. And at that point, there started to be questions, what should be the next step? Does the US really need to stay in Afghanistan? And the view of the Bush administration was absolutely, yes, we got to continue to go after these bad guys. There had been opportunities at the end of 2001 for the US to negotiate with the Taliban, some type of reconciliation, but the Bush administration was not interested. They wanted to keep fighting the war. And so we then got to a point where the US was continuing to be in Afghanistan. The Bush administration said that's the way it was going to be. Then came the war in Iraq, another major milestone. Not even 2 years after US forces entered Afghanistan, the Bush administration really took its eye off the ball in Afghanistan to reallocate resources and bandwidth to Iraq, where it launched this terrible war, which was never nearly as popular in the US as the war in Afghanistan was initially. And when the US took its eye off the ball in Afghanistan, that allowed the Taliban to reconstitute itself and to really ratchet up an insurgency that had been forming in the months prior. And the war then started to get to a point where the Taliban was coming back. It was starting to fight Afghan forces. It was fighting US forces. And at that point, I think it became more difficult in Washington to sustain this idea, this narrative of a necessary noble war, because US forces were getting killed. It wasn't clear why the US was still in Afghanistan, given that it had achieved its initial goals. Why was it still there? And that at that point, the narratives didn't disappear altogether, but you just didn't have as much attention put on the war by the US government. And then we got to a point where the war began to not be forgotten, but it simply was not it was not a priority in US public discourse. The media wasn't covering it. But then there was another shift when the Obama administration came to power, and it decided to surge thousands of troops into Afghanistan. This is 2009, 2010. And at that point, the US narrative around the war was essentially, well, we need to do everything we can to tame this insurgency, to rein in this insurgency so that we can create the conditions for a reconciliation process and then a withdrawal. But we know that didn't work. The withdrawal, the troop surge did not work. The war continued. The US really started to struggle. And this is when the war became very unpopular. This is when you started hearing more calls for withdrawals from the war. And this is when you had this really ugly, expanded, or really what I would describe as a mission creep on steroids, that it was unclear. The US was never able to develop a strategy, much less a narrative, for why it was still fighting in Afghanistan, even after sending tens of thousands of troops there to try to change the situation on the ground, and that didn't work. And so then you had the Trump administration, which even more than President Trump, even more than President Obama, wanted to leave Afghanistan. So for President Trump, his idea, his narrative around the war was that, well, we're there to kill terrorists. We're not there to do anything else. We're hoping to get out soon enough. And then he, of course, set in motion the process to get out when he had Zalmay Khalilzad negotiate with the Taliban for a withdrawal of US troops. And then, that was that. And then, of course, the Biden administration, you had, again, a government that did not want to stay. Joe Biden and Barack and Donald Trump are so different in so many ways, but they do have a similar view on Afghanistan. They wanted to get out. They wanted to move on to other things. And that's what Biden did. So basically, the arc of the US narrative on the war in Afghanistan has evolved very sharply from this idea of a necessary noble war to a war that simply is not worth fighting and cannot end soon enough from a US perspective. In terms of how Pakistan fits into this, well, just because of the nature of the US-Pakistan relationship, there's always been a fair amount of concern here in Washington about how helpful Pakistan really was being in terms of helping the US achieve its goals. And indeed, the belief here in Washington, the strong belief that Pakistan has hindered US efforts in a big way by continuing to support the very actors that the US had sought to fight for so many years, that is a very strong narrative. And it's very difficult to get away from that. Things did change a bit during the Trump era because, yes, the US-Pakistan relationship got off to a bad start when Trump took over, and he announced on Twitter that he was going to cut aid and all of that because he was unhappy about Pakistan's relationship to the Haqqani network. But then when President Trump recognized that in order to set in motion a process to get US troops to leave, Pakistan would need to be involved in that process, the US-Pakistan relationship changed in a hurry. I mean, Pakistan was seen as part of the solution in Afghanistan, as opposed to just part of the problem. Looking at the present with President Biden, I mean, there hasn't been a clear narrative from the White House on Pakistan. A review is underway, a policy review is underway to figure out what to do about the relationship with Pakistan. Clearly, the Biden administration has, like the Trump administration, viewed Pakistan as an important player in the Afghanistan context. Just with the US attention shifting to how to maintain a counterterrorism capacity with the withdrawal over with now, I think there's a recognition that Pakistan should be involved in some way. I mean, the administration has sought to explore pathways for cooperation with Pakistan. It's unclear to what extent any progress had made in terms of seeing if Pakistan would be willing to host US forces on their soil. That's not going to happen, clearly. But now I think for the Biden administration, the question is, how involved does it want Pakistan to be? Does the US want to try to form new intelligence sharing arrangements with Pakistan? Does it want to be able to continue to enjoy overflight rights provided by Pakistan to allow US aircraft to fly over Pakistan into Afghanistan for surveillance and counterterrorism activities? And that's the big question. To what extent does the Biden administration see Pakistan playing a role in the US over the horizon counterterrorism capacity? Because if it sees Pakistan having to play a role in that regard, it's going to want to maintain a workable cooperative relationship with the Pakistanis. Final point is that, yes, there has been a lot of Pakistan blaming in Washington in recent weeks, but I wouldn't overstate that. Much of it comes from Capitol Hill, which has always tended to be, on many levels, critical of Pakistan, even hostile. But Capitol Hill does not set policy on Pakistan. It's the administration that does that. And the administration and its public messaging about Pakistan has not been overly critical of Pakistan. It's indicated that it doesn't favor a broad, deep relationship with Pakistan, but it has not said anything about wanting to sanction Pakistan or take a hard line. That messaging has come from Capitol Hill.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for a very elaborate answer. And I think that sets many a record right. And also you bring to light the entire trajectory of the policy thinking on Afghanistan in the US and how that has evolved with different administrations coming in the government in the US. But I think one critical, question, that's just emerged from your conversation is that the current prime minister in Pakistan, and you might have heard some of his speeches, has maintained this since the very early days of the Afghan war, that there is no kinetic military solution to the war. And he's maintained this for the past 2 decades. And now when, this sudden withdrawal happened and, it was kind of a sad conclusion to, a war that in the end, of course, promised establishment of institutions within Afghanistan and promised, some political stability in Afghanistan. The withdrawal basically, the sudden withdrawal, and I'd ask you a question on this as well, if you believe so, that the withdrawal basically, exacerbated things, especially politically in Afghanistan. And, the prime minister now believes that his narrative has actually come out to be true. What predictions he made back in 2003, 2004, that this would be, the kinetic military intervention in Afghanistan would turn out to be disruptive for the region. He thinks that his narrative has come out to be true, of course. So what is your take on that? And now, because Imran Khan is now in office as the prime minister of Prime Minister of Pakistan. I think that sort of that stance that he took as an opposition leader now would be seen in force, even though Pakistan's military or Pakistan's government does have some involvements with Afghanistan right now. I think it would be, do you think that it would be a policy of estrangement from Pakistan, that it would begin to now estrange itself from matters in Afghanistan? Or would you see Imran Khan, or Pakistan forming a deep state within Afghanistan, which is also feared by India or many other regional players? What do you see would be Imran Khan's next policy stance?
Yeah, another great question, and I'll be less elaborate and I'll employ more brevity in my response this time. No, I think, make no mistake, Prime Minister Khan was absolutely on the mark in his claiming that there's no military solution, that there never has been a military solution in Afghanistan. He's right. And he's also right when he says that the right time for the US to have tried to negotiate with the Taliban would have been much earlier on, when the US had more leverage, especially when it had thousands of troops on the ground. He's absolutely right. I can't disagree. I think that, for the US, there had always been a hope of negotiating an end to the war. But, as I said before, the whole idea behind the troop surge was to change battlefield reality so that the Taliban would feel weaker and more on the defensive, so that it would be willing to come to talks and negotiate an end to the war. It didn't work out that way, of course. But I do agree with Prime Minister Khan's comments. I will say this, though, and I recognize this may be a bit provocative to say, particularly for in terms of an audience in Pakistan, but on some levels, Pakistan's own policies made it particularly difficult for there to be a military solution to the war, right? I mean, the fact that Pakistan provided safe havens to the top Pakistani leadership for many years, that was something that kept the Taliban strong. It's not the only thing that kept the Taliban strong. I do not agree with those that argue that had Pakistan never had a relationship with the Taliban, had it never provided sanctuary to the top leadership, had it never provided medical care to foot soldiers, then the Taliban would have never been strong. I don't agree with that at all. There were many reasons why the Taliban was able to be so strong, including, state collapse in Afghanistan and the US's own poor strategy. But at any rate, there's plenty of academic evidence, scholarship that has shown that whenever an insurgency enjoys a cross-border sanctuary, that it's very difficult to see those insurgencies defeated. So having that sanctuary in Pakistan helped the Taliban. It helped it remain strong. So that's something that you wouldn't hear acknowledged by the Prime Minister, but I think that's an important point to put out there. Now, in terms of what Pakistan's next steps are in Afghanistan, it's tough to say. I think that Pakistan, like so many other countries in the region, like most, if not all countries in the region, wants to be very cautious before figuring out what to do. It wants to see what the Taliban ends up doing. I think Pakistan will want to see if the Taliban is able to consolidate power, which will not be very easy. They will want to see if the Taliban is able to deal with these incredibly complex policy challenges, or rather emergencies, like this horrific humanitarian crisis Afghanistan is experiencing. I think that Pakistan will also want to see what the Taliban is able to do about these terrorist threats that concern Pakistan. Of course, the TTP for sure, but also ISIS-Khorasan. These are threats for Afghanistan. Pardon me, these are threats for Pakistan. ISIS is a threat for Afghanistan as well. So I think that before making any quick decisions about recognition and how closely Pakistan will want to work with the Taliban, it will want to sit back and see what the Taliban does, at least for the next few months. That said, Pakistan does have an advantage in that it has this long relationship with the Taliban, which means that it has channels of communication, it has influence, it has access with this new government in Afghanistan. And I think that is something that suggests that even if Pakistan is in no rush to recognize the Taliban government, and I think it's not in any rush to do that, it'll have the ability to engage quite closely with the Taliban anyway. And so I think that at this point, I think we're going to see Pakistan being very cautious, but also try to engage in very, I don't want to say low-hanging fruit because nothing is simple in Afghanistan, but I think that, Pakistan will want to try to be in the forefront of efforts to deliver humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. It's already done that. It has been helping with evacuations of foreign nationals from Afghanistan. So I think that it'll continue to want to do that. But beyond that, I do think that Pakistan will hope that the security environment in Afghanistan remains relatively stable so that it can be in a position to work with partners, especially China, to bring infrastructure investments into Afghanistan. I know that for Pakistan, it really wants to not necessarily bring BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, into Afghanistan, but it wants to see China and other countries too, maybe Russia and others, in a position to deploy capital and to start build infrastructure projects in Afghanistan to hasten Pakistan's access to Central Asia. And Pakistan for quite some time has been trying to grow out its relations with Central Asia through new connectivity projects, including a new rail corridor project with Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. I guess this is part of Pakistan's geoeconomics vision, so to speak. But this is going to all be very difficult to do because I think it's unlikely that you're going to have a stable situation prevailing in Afghanistan. I think the Taliban is going to struggle to consolidate power. I think that we could see in due course a new armed resistance emerging, and that'll clearly make things more difficult for Pakistan. But again, I'll close with this note that Pakistan has an advantage that few other countries have, including those countries that have built relations with the Taliban over the last few years. Pakistan has a very long-standing relationship with the Taliban, which enables it to have influence with the regime, even though it has not and will not recognize the Taliban anytime soon. And that gives it options in terms of how it wants to engage in the country.
Right. Thank you. I think I seem to agree with many of the things you've said. Just on Pakistan's role again, as I see the situation in this region right now, there's India, and I've heard some Indian journalists basically talk about this, that the Indian investments in Afghanistan have bore no fruit after the American exit now, and Pakistan now has greater ownership in Afghanistan than India does. So some of those investments have gone down the drain. Pakistan thinks that it has been betrayed in the region because it lost all these lives over the past 2 decades, made all these investments in Afghanistan. So it bore some economic and human losses, and the tally has been increasing over the, I think the tally has been increasing every day now in Pakistan. So with more lives being lost to terrorism, more economic losses, and so on and so forth. So Pakistan has not really emerged out of the crisis. The Americans also think that they've made certain investments in the form of aid to Pakistan, and then of course investments in Afghanistan, and the number is huge. And they think, a lot of Americans think that we should not have gone to war, or something, that it was too late to come out of the war. We should have exited earlier than this. The exit could have been gradual and more planned. So there are different narratives. But the Americans also think that, and I've heard a lot of journalists basically talk about this, that the American policy in Afghanistan also failed. And then there is this civil society, which thinks that, Afghanistan has been badly wronged in this war. We've left Afghanistan in a bigger mess right now. The economy is basically failing. There's a humanitarian crisis, as you mentioned. So there are these 4 big narratives: the Indian narrative, the Pakistani narrative. The Pakistanis also think that we've been fighting terrorism, but we are called the safe havens of terrorism, as you also conceded to the big opinion in the US right now. And the Americans also think that Pakistan as an ally did not do the efforts that the Americans expected it to do to cull the menace of terrorism from the region. So how do you think, of course, Afghanistan is in a mess right now, and, there's a clash of these narratives. How do you think that these narratives could be reconciled, and how that reconciliation could basically take this region and the Afghan crisis forward? Do you think there are any sort of opportunities to reconcile these narratives and, bring a concerted effort to rehabilitate Afghanistan?
Well, I think it would be very difficult to reconcile these divergent narratives, mainly because of the reality of the India-Pakistan dispute. The two countries, of course, are rivals, but they have such different visions about how they would like things to be in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan, of course, has long been a battlefield for rivalry, if not proxy conflict between India and Pakistan for many years. But looking at this with a glass half full approach, the region, the broader region, including India and Pakistan, do have some shared interests in Afghanistan. And I think that the big one is the issue of terrorism. Now, certainly, different countries have different threat perceptions, and the different countries think that one particular terrorist group is more significant than others, and so on. But you look at something like ISIS Khorasan, which worries everyone. There's not one country in the region that doesn't worry about ISIS Khorasan. Certainly Pakistan's immediate neighbors, Iran and Pakistan and the Central Asian states, but also Russia and India, many others too. So one could argue that counterterrorism could pose as a potential pathway for some type of new regional consensus involving cooperation in Afghanistan. Drugs is another key issue. Many countries in the region have really serious drug epidemics, including heroin crises, and the majority of that heroin is sourced from Afghanistan. And here you talk about, Iran, Pakistan, India, China, Russia, the Central Asian states. So I think that could be another area of interest. The Taliban has claimed that it's going to ban poppy production. I find it hard to believe the Taliban will do that, especially since it's made so much money off the drug trade and it has so many competing priorities. I don't think enforcing a ban on one of the only major growth industries in Afghanistan, I don't think that is something the Taliban would want to do. So I think that the region still has to worry about the drug trade for sure. Refugees is another big concern for so many countries in the region. So if you look at these three issues, refugees, drug trade, counterterrorism, terrorism, these are all issues, these are all shared concerns that are exacerbated by an Afghanistan that is more unstable, right? Destabilization will make those three problems even more of a concern for the region. So that poses the question of mechanisms, institutional mechanisms to bring together the countries of the region to discuss these issues and talk about paths forward. You have certain institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Heart of Asia Istanbul process, regional organizations that focus on Afghanistan on their agendas. There's been a lot of criticism of both in the sense that they have, people come together and talk a lot, but nothing actually comes from it. That's a fair point. So then that suggests that perhaps there could be other pathways through just, actual multilateral diplomacy initiated, engineered by the countries themselves. Russia, as we now know, is planning to host a major conference on Afghanistan, at which, as I understand it, many of the key players, including India and Pakistan, will be invited to that. That's a good thing. I don't look at this through the lens of strategy and rivalry, that it's not good that America's Russian rival is doing this. I think it's a great thing, especially with the US having left Afghanistan. So I'll leave you on a positive note here. I think that there are some shared interests that the region has about Afghanistan, and it can't hurt to establish mechanisms, regular mechanisms for dialogue, where you could have these countries come together to meet once a month to discuss ways forward. And obviously you want the Taliban at the table for those discussions as well. I think that would be difficult to do so long as the region doesn't recognize the Taliban government. But I think that many countries in the region will eventually recognize it. Even if they don't, you can still have the Taliban at the table. The Russians plan to have the Taliban at the table at this conference in Moscow later this month. So the region has to step up, quite frankly. The US has left the scene. It's not going to be playing much of a role. I think that you need to look to the region to step up.
Well, I love your optimism about India and Pakistan, how you think, institutional mechanisms and shared interests could bring India and Pakistan closer. I have a few disagreements on that, but I think we're running out of time. So just last two questions, Michael. I thank you so much for very elaborate answers, and I think this is really going to help my audience have a perspective on the region. just on the China factor, because you mentioned Pakistan's role and Pakistan, how Pakistan basically in a way, in different words than you said, that did not really come up to the expectations of how some top Taliban leaders were basically found a safe haven in Pakistan. Just on that note, there is another narrative in Pakistan which believes that, this divergence, in terms of interests between US and Pakistan happened at the time when the Americans basically jumped on this Asia pivot policy in the region back in 2006 or somewhat around that time, when it basically pivoted towards Asia and wanted to find a counterbalancing force in India to counterbalance the emerging threat of China. And that is when Pakistan also thought that, since India was increasing or expanding its role in Afghanistan, Pakistan then, began to selectively target some Taliban leadership. And that is when, the problem basically, or the disagreement between Pakistan and the US began to take place. Do you really agree that the Asia pivot policy and the China factor had a role to play in Pakistan government targeting certain selective Taliban groups and not others, because it wanted to have that strategic depth in Afghanistan against the expanding Indian role in Afghanistan? Do you really believe in that narrative? Do you think China or Pakistan's closeness with China and the Asia pivot policy had a role to play in these some groups of the Taliban finding support from Pakistan? Do you really believe in that?
Yeah, great question. Very briefly, let me go back to your very valid point about noting that perhaps I was being overly optimistic about India-Pakistan cooperation in Afghanistan. I hear you, and I told you that I was going to offer a glass half full approach. Certainly, I think that the glass half empty approach is important too, and I think that what I'm encouraging is that there be efforts to bring India and Pakistan together with other regions, other countries in the region to discuss these shared concerns. But I think in reality, I think what's more likely is that we'll see India increasingly on the outside, left on the outside looking in. I think we'll see Pakistan working with these other regional players. India won't be as involved in these conversations, especially because it doesn't have that relationship with the Taliban that so many other countries in the region, not just Pakistan, do. India was, of course, the last country in the region to formally open up channels of communication with the Taliban, which has come back to bite the Indians now because the Taliban is in government, and that means that India has very limited influence or leverage over this government. So I'll say that. So to your question,
agree.
Yeah, good. So to your question on the Pakistan strategic depth, this China factor, sort of like separate out some of these different issues that you've brought up here. I do think that China and the US both worry about the terrorism issue in the region. I think that perhaps the US and China have different terror groups that they worry about the most. Clearly a group like ETIM, a group comprised mainly of Uyghur militants in Afghanistan, is a group that really worries China in a big way. It doesn't worry the US. The US even delisted it from its its list of terrorist organizations. And I think the Haqqani network, which of course has always been a major concern for the US, is not a huge concern for China. It is to the extent that China has always wanted to bring investment into Afghanistan, but is held back because of the conflict and the war there. And the Haqqani network is one of the big militant players in Afghanistan and has been for quite some time. But I think that China has been increasingly concerned about these groups in Pakistan that directly threaten Chinese interests and nationals there. These Baluch terrorists, the Pakistani Taliban, which has always been a concern for China. So I think that the terrorism issue is a concern, but I think that the issue of the pivot or the Indo-Pacific policy, as it's now called, that's a separate matter. And for me, I think the Indo-Pacific policy really amplifies the limitations of US-Pakistan partnership and more broadly highlights very explicitly how China is a limiting factor in advancing and expanding the US-Pakistan relationship, just because China, of course, has that alliance with Pakistan. And even though the US would not state this publicly, the main raison d'etre, sorry, my French is not that good. The main raison d'etre for the Indo-Pacific policy is to counter Chinese power. And Pakistan, obviously, as an ally of China, has no interest in doing that. And so, while you've seen over the last few months efforts by the US to try to strengthen relations with the smaller South Asian states beyond India, it sees that as important to wean these small South Asian states away from China and Chinese influence. Many of these countries like Maldives, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, they become battlegrounds for India-China competition. The US wants to wean those countries away from China and more toward the US, and by extension, more toward India. But Pakistan is different because the US recognizes that Pakistan is closely allied with China. There's obviously no competition between India and China and Pakistan. It doesn't work that way for obvious reasons. And so I think that Pakistan, I'd said before that India is going to be left on the outside looking in on these regional diplomatic efforts on Afghanistan. Pakistan is going to be the odd country out when it comes to the Indo-Pacific policy. And I think that's a reality that I imagine has been acknowledged, if not accepted, in Islamabad. And I think that it's something that could prompt Pakistan to want to work even more closely with China and other countries that are increasingly closer to China, like Russia, for example, another major competitor of the US. But getting back to the Afghanistan angle, Pakistan has its own reasons for the policies that it's had in Afghanistan over the years in terms of its sponsorship of groups like the Haqqani Network. And I see that as happening for reasons that have little to do with China. I think that it's really, but several factors. One is a very practical, even if not understandable factor, a hedging strategy. Pakistan, like all the countries in the region, knew for a long time that eventually the US would leave Afghanistan, and it figured that when that happened, things could get really shaky and volatile and unstable in Afghanistan, and therefore it was important to maintain ties and leverage over the key non-state actor, and that being the Taliban, including its Haqqani Network faction. And Pakistan has derived leverage over the Taliban over the years because of the safe havens it's provided for the Taliban leadership. And India is clearly the other factor that Pakistan has wanted to make it difficult for India to operate in Afghanistan, especially given that India has had such a major role in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. It's had a very close relationship with the non-Taliban governments. And so I think that Pakistan has viewed the Taliban as a useful asset, quite frankly, because the Taliban has generally been an anti-India force. It's no friend of India's. So I think that's what it comes down to. So, there's a lot of discussion about whether the strategic depth policy still applies now. Certainly with the Taliban now in power in Afghanistan, it may not have to. But my broader point is that I don't think considerations about China had anything to do with Pakistan's policies in Afghanistan. I mean, quite frankly, given that China's main interest in Afghanistan has been stability so that it can bring its investments into Afghanistan, it would have made more sense for Pakistan to cease all ties to destabilizing actors in Afghanistan. That would have helped Chinese interest, to be sure. That's not something that China really pushed Pakistan on at any rate. So I think it's important to separate these different streams here. I mean, the China issue, the Asia pivot, the pivot to Asia, to East Asia, and these broader issues. I think it's important to separate them out. Pakistan has interests like any other country does. It's going to pursue them the way that it wants to, including in Afghanistan. It pursued those interests, but again, I would underscore that China was not a key factor in how Pakistan decided to pursue its interest in Afghanistan.
All right, that sounds great. If you can spare a few more minutes, I just want to shoot one more question, which will be our last.
Sure.
All right. Okay. So just on the Afghan economy, I've been doing some research on the economy, and there's this dollar flight that has taken place, and most of the commodities, including food. Afghanistan is a largely import-driven economy, and now there's this emerging food crisis in Afghanistan, which can assume very, very large proportions. And so there's this large economic threat looming over Afghanistan, and because of this a huge focus on the Afghan politics and, the neighborhood, the region, and, defense strategies and so on and so forth. That takes away focus from the Afghan economy and, this humanitarian crisis that people are facing right now. People are losing jobs. Economic growth has actually flattened over the last, I think, ever since COVID happened, but now more so in the last month or so. And, some assets, Afghan assets, some aid promised to the country by the IMF and some assets with the US have also been frozen. So the Afghan currency is also losing value, and it could crash in the next coming days if the Afghan government is not supported, and if it's not able to sort of sustain the current level of its currency, which would mean that it would need support from the region and from the US and from countries that have dollars. So how do you see this dollar crisis emerging in Afghanistan? And, do you really think that Afghanistan, this policy of self-reliance of the Taliban would really work? Or would they really have to engage with the US and other power players in the region and outside? And do you really see chances of, Taliban coming closer to the Americans for aid and to the IMF and World Bank? Or do you think that they would just disengage and try to run the economy on their own? And if it would happen, do you really think that the support would be enough to resuscitate the economy?
Yeah, these are great questions that could form a whole separate conversation for sure. They're great questions. Absolutely, I think that the big issue in Afghanistan now is the humanitarian crisis and the associated economic crisis. Look, I've never been a fan of sanctions policies. I think that it's very unfortunate that the US and the West have frozen, what, 10 or $11 billion of Afghan foreign reserves. But the question is, if that money was unfrozen, would the Taliban be in a position to use that money to actually fix or solve this incredibly complex policy emergency? Right? I mean, the Taliban doesn't have experience as well. It does have experience as a government. It controlled 90% of Afghanistan in the 1990s. But we know that its idea of governance was very focused around justice and things like that. The idea of the Taliban receiving all this money and very methodically coming up with an economic recovery plan or a stimulus package or whatever, that's absurd. I mean, the Taliban doesn't have that expertise. So I think that this is such a huge policy conundrum. On the one hand, there's an important debate to be had as to whether it's appropriate and makes sense for that money to be unfrozen and not sort of used as a condition for eventual aid to Afghanistan if the Taliban becomes more moderate. There's a debate to be had around that. But even if you look ahead and if you imagine that money is released to the Taliban, would it be in a position to use it in the right way? And I'm not sure that's the case. This then brings up the question of the government and the inclusivity of the government. Can we expect that the Taliban would be willing to bring in non-Taliban leaders, technocrats, economists who would be in a position to deal with this complex policy emergency if it gets access to that money? I think that many of the skill set that the Taliban really needs in the government right now, the people that have that skill set, many of them have left Afghanistan. Others would likely be afraid to work in a Taliban government. So these are big questions to be worked out. I mean, for me, it's humanitarian assistance that's most important now. And I think that the US, I know, and some other countries have developed mechanisms. The Treasury Department has produced licenses for the US that will allow it to deliver large amounts of money to Afghanistan through non-official channels. But that then raises the question of how cooperative will the Taliban be with allowing all this money to come into the country, going to non-government destinations, so to speak. The Taliban has not yet gotten in the way of humanitarian supplies. It hasn't prevented them from being delivered, which I think makes sense. But these are all issues that have to be worked out, and I don't have an answer. Even if all that 10 or $11 billion is released, if it would be enough, I don't think it would be, given the huge level of dependence that the Taliban, that Afghanistan has on foreign assistance. It needs more, and this is one reason why the Taliban really values legitimacy and wants to get recognition from a number of countries, because with recognition would come foreign assistance. But you look at it the other way. If the Taliban is able to get recognition from a few countries in the region, let's say China, Russia, maybe a few of the Gulf countries, and it gets some aid from those countries, that could not compensate from all the money that the West has kept away from the Taliban. You know, China has committed to what, $30 million in assistance to Afghanistan. That's small potatoes compared to everything else that's out there that it doesn't have access to. So I think that you just had, at the immediate term, and I'll end here, you need to focus on getting in humanitarian assistance, having the UN, as it already is, on the ground to manage the inflows of this money and in a position to deliver it. You know, countries, neighboring countries, especially Pakistan, in a position to keep delivering humanitarian supplies, working in coordination with the UN and other international organizations. I think that's where you need to start, and I'll end there.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining me. I love this conversation. Wish we could have more time and I could ask you more questions, but we could always do, I think, another episode of The Alternate Narrative. I don't know how good your Urdu is, but I would want to say shukriya and assalamu alaikum to you. And thank you so much for joining me. Wish you best of luck. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for having me. Would love to do it again one time.
All right. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.